Hello everyone, welcome to the presentation on cost-benefit analysis. Now, not everyone will use this for the final presentations, but for those who do want to consider cost-benefit analysis, I want to put this lecture together so you understand it because it turns out a lot of people don't. And we're not talking students, we're talking the professional world. So let's get started now. All right, so the challenge with cost-benefit analysis is there is no set standard. It's no simple form. There is actually a very simple formula, but how you go about it is so complex that you will find out once you get in the professional world, consulting world, that nobody really understands what's going on. So what they do is everybody just kind of agrees on a general process, and but I'm going to give you the framework of how that all works today. So typically it's valued in money. You hear that a lot, but it doesn't have to be. It could be number of jobs created or a productivity figure, such as number of cars produced on an assembly line or number of cars going through an intersection. And then of course there's time savings, where instead of taking a worker to do 5 units, they can now, by this project, increase up to 20 units an hour. Or instead of cars going 40 miles per hour and only covering 5 miles in, taking 20 minutes, the cars would be able to get those 5 miles in 5 minutes. So those are all kind of examples of where the value of the project is not in money, but typically, as I mentioned, money is the basis for determining all the projects. And I'll get a little more details in a moment here about that. But ultimately, how you measure it will be determined by your customer and any available metrics that you determine are valuable to your cost-benefit analysis. Because this is where, especially if you're consulting, it comes down to the customer. The customer will try to tell you, not always the case, but will try to tell you what they value and how they want you to measure your cost-benefit. So there's different types of cost benefit. There's the ex ante, where you do it before the project has begun because you're trying to consider, is it worth doing? Then there's ex post, which is the project's already completed. Now you're trying to figure out, did we do everything that we said we're going to do? Such as, did it cost the amount of time? Did it cost the amount of money? Did you do it at the same time? But then there's also where you might be doing cost benefit analysis in the process of the project. These are especially for multi-year projects with milestones, trying to figure out, did everything work before continuing on to the next level. But essentially, a cost-benefit analysis does have a very simple formula, which is net benefits equals benefits minus costs. That's all cost-benefit analysis is. The problem is, what are those benefits and what are the costs? That's a challenge and much more difficult than you think. So again, another point is cost benefit analysis, it's allocation of resources. It's not to do a project. So that's why it's not just simple yes, no. When you're, for example, if you're the chancellor in charge of a university, you have a tremendous amount of resources. You have money, you have personnel, you have research to do. But it comes down to, where do you invest all the money? You can't just do every project that's out there. You have to consider what is worth pursuing. And you will find this in government organizations or private industry. There's limited funds and resources, and you have to determine what to proceed with. And that's really what cost benefit analysis is about. It's not just a simple go with the project or don't go with the project. And a part of that is also, you have to consider all the alternatives and choose the best alternative. So it's not the case of, should we do this, but it's also, what are all the alternatives to get this project, to do this, and what are all of those alternatives? This is where cost-benefit analysis gets bigger and bigger and bigger. It starts with a simple formula, but it gets huge by the end. And then, of course, it's more than just proving returns. It needs to consider all the alternatives, because a lot of times what you start off with thinking is the right answer will not be the right answer. There might actually be a better alternative, and sometimes that alternative could be as simple as not doing anything at all. So that's really what the process is of doing cost-benefit analysis, is determining, is the original project worth pursuing, or are there better alternatives, or is the alternative not doing anything? So here are the general steps of the cost-benefit analysis. We'll go one by one through these steps. But you can see it's just takes you through the process. Some of these steps we won't cover here. I'll explain that, such as discounting the benefits and performing sensitivity analysis, but you might run up against them in the future. All right, so let's start with finding alternative options. As I mentioned, it's not a question of allocating resources. It's a question of allocating resources. It's not just a question of choosing a project. So what you want to do is consider all the alternatives, including the status quo and no-call option. That's very important. We kind of forget about what if we do nothing, what happens? So you always want to consider that. And then you want to consider all the alternatives. Then moving on is something called standing. Who benefits and who has a cost? For example, and this really is like who matters. Where you want to narrow, when you look at a project, you'll have all these benefits and only costs, but you have to determine who really matters. You know, for example, if you're upgrading a road to a county road to an expressway, you know, who will actually matter in determining to upgrade that? Will it be local residents? They'll likely have some standing. Local businesses, they'll be affected, so they'll likely have some standing. Wildlife, in some places they do, in other places they still don't. So that's a questionable item. But federal regulations would likely have standing, unless it's specifically a state project run by state money, then federal regulations might not have standing. But then another example is if you're upgrading this expressway, would drivers from another state have standing? Probably not, but they might. And that's why you just have to figure out, do they matter? That's really what standing is about. All right, then you decide what benefits and costs count. Many times there are additional benefits or indirect benefits that you might not even recognize. For example, with our case of upgrading a local road to an expressway, well, the immediate benefit is reduced congestion. That's probably what you focused on first. But also, there's new businesses that develop at exits. Heck, a Walmart might show up there. Closure of other businesses that no longer are on the road. All I have to say is just watch if you're familiar with the movie Cars, you know Radiator Springs well. That's where we're going, but they'll be affected. Then there's also noise and pollution will increase. And then, of course, there's the effect on wildlife in the area. So those are all the additional benefits or indirect costs that would occur when you look at a project. Also, benefits might not be immediate. They can come in stages. For example, in the expressway example, we might originally look at today, 60,000 vehicles will be able to be handled. That's the capacity of the expressway in an average day. But then there's also the fact of over the year, what will be the benefits? Well, going from the country road to an expressway might save 100 lives over a year, you know. And then, but also could be reducing congestion 20% by month. Not necessarily, those aren't values, lives and congestion aren't something you can monitor every day, but you can over periods. So that's why benefits have to be looked at over time. Now there's attaching dollar values called monetizing. You might see this a lot because money is common. Everybody, you know, with the US dollar has agreed to a value for the money and what a dollar's worth. So that gets over the problem of apples to oranges comparison. You know, if you're comparing upgrading your expressway to congestion, it's really hard to compare it to investing in the expressway with lives saved. So how do you get around that? Well, what they've done is actually people have determined the value of life saved. If you ever question this is exactly what insurance companies do, is figure out how much your life is worth. They also set the monetary value of a job created. So what it is kind of this set numerical values that an industry agrees to. But this is where you get to a common denominator, which is the money of the value. And this allows you to compare costs with benefits across. And the challenge here, though, is this is more science than actual measurement, especially if you look at feasibility studies, for example, in civil engineering. you always have to go with like, what are they actually, how do they calculate the number of jobs created? But that's where you want to get to, where a common denominator where you're comparing across all what the cost of the project would be with its benefits. And like I said, this always usually goes back to money. All right, we won't get into this, but then there's the discount values of benefits. This is really $1 today is more valuable than $1 tomorrow. Think of this as in terms of inflation, where a McDonald's hamburger in 1980 was $2.60. Today it costs $6 or more. So that's just a case of where if you invest $1 today, you probably get more money back. And this comes into the situation of like, do we do the project today or do we hold off the project till later? So that's called net present value. There's a whole class in the business school on it if you want to, but you probably won't get into it. But the reason I mention this is because the benefits of cost need to be discounted back to today's dollar value. It's like I said, something complicated. We won't cover in this class. You don't need to cover in this class, but when you get into a consulting world or beyond the university here, you might run into it. All right, so next, let's talk about performing sensitivity analysis. This is, again, something else you won't want to do. But what you really want to do is figure out what is the best scenario for the project, what is the worst thing to happen in this project, and what is likely to happen. And then you run the numbers about the cost and the benefits based upon the best, worst, and likely scenarios. And that's what's called a sensitivity analysis. You might jump into this with your final project, but you really don't have to. For our brief 2 weeks of putting the project together, it's really hard to do for that short period of time. But in a longer term project, you'll have to do that. All right, and then you summarize it all up. You've done your analysis, now it's time to make a recommendation. And what you do is you go with what's called the greatest net present value. That's essentially taking all the benefits, all the costs, all the alternatives, discounting it back to today's dollars, and then coming up with saying this is the best recommendation. Now, for this class, we're not going to do net present value or anything like that. But what you're looking for is what has the greatest net benefits. When you consider all the alternatives, who benefits the most? And that is something that might actually surprise you. I've had several classes where they thought one alternative was the answer. They did the cost benefit analysis and they realized there was another alternative out there. So that's why you want to consider it all and this be part of your project. And now the great news is you get to consider all the standing benefits and costs to consider for this final project. I'll actually give you a template how to do this with just a matrix, for example, but there's different ways to do it. All right, so again, for the final presentation, if you're going to try and do a cost-benefit analysis, then just consider and compare the alternatives, including the status quo. Don't forget that one. Decide who has benefits and costs, called standing. Select the measurements. Predict the length of the benefits. Attach dollar value to the impacts, and then finally make a recommendation. As I mentioned, you don't need to worry about sensitivity analysis or discounting. Alrighty, that's it for this presentation. Give me a holler if you have any questions. Take care, y'all.